fabulous Danube Institute audience, staff, fellows, leadership. Thank you all for being here on this fine evening. And we are here with a very aptly titled event tonight, Elections Have Consequences. And to speak to this, we have a truly international panel. We have our guest speaker, keynote speaker, James Allan from the University of Queensland School of Law in Australia. He's the Garrett Professor of Law, and he's not a stranger to the Danube Institute. He's been here several times over the years. We have Anna Elise, who is president of the Emmenberg Foundation, and she's from the U.S. She was also one of the election observers, so she might have some interesting comments. And finally, acting as moderator this evening is our visiting fellow from France, Pierre-Hugues Barret. Uge. I will still have to work on that. And John O'Sullivan, president of the Danube Institute from the UK and the US, will also be joining us. And when I asked James what exactly he wanted to talk about tonight, he said his main goal was to be interesting and funny. So I hope that you will be an appreciative audience of our very interesting and I'm sure very humorous guest. James.
That's one of those set you up to fail introductions. Thank you, Melissa. Well, let me start by saying how delightful it is to be back in Budapest. I've been here 5 or 6 times anyway. It's a city I get to visit because of my connection with what I think is one of the best think tanks in the world, which is remarkable for a country of this size. I'd also like to take a chance to thank John and Melissa O'Sullivan, who are the sort of head honchos of this organization, as well as all the other incredibly talented people who work for and are associated with the Danube Institute. So I'm honored to be even peripherally connected with it. You can tell from the accent I'm not originally from Australia, I'm from Canada. And it's something of a tradition in Canada to start talks with a quick joke. The idea is you get a laugh, the audience perhaps becomes a tad more sympathetic. And I have a regular collection of jokes I pick from, usually trot one out at whatever talk I'm giving. But tonight, I'm using a brand new joke. It's never been used by me before. But I have to warn you, it requires a modicum of numeracy from the audience, so I hope there's no lawyers here, or at least a familiarity with the basic precepts of arithmetic. So this is the story of 3 American friends, they're longtime friends, who once a year, every year, will gather on the opening of the bear hunting season, and they go hunting for one day, once a year. One of the friends is a doctor, one's a lawyer, and one's a statistician. So on the opening day in the morning of the hunting season, the 3 friends spend the whole morning, they don't find a single bear. But right after lunch, they see one. So the doctor picks up his rifle, he raises it, he aims, shoots. He misses the bear a meter to the left. So the lawyer friend, of course, smirks, thinks this is pretty funny. He picks up his rifle, he aims, he shoots, he misses a meter to the right. The statistician friend looks at his other 2 friends, throws his hands in the air and yells, "We got it!" Okay. I need to start by saying something about democracy, because how you understand the concept of democracy, has real life consequences, and people disagree about how best to understand this concept. So it's a contested, disputed concept or notion. So I'm only simplifying a tiny little bit now when I give you the 2 main competing schools of thought. Let me start with the older one. This sees democracy in procedural terms, right? So it's about how governments and leaders are chosen. And the core idea here is that more beats fewer. That's from my mom, fewer. She didn't say, don't say less. Democracy, on this understanding, basically boils down to let the numbers count. So each adult of sound mind counts equally. He or she votes. You have regular elections. You count heads. Majoritarianism is the key. There's no Iranian-style Council of Guardians to vet what are acceptable and unacceptable views, or excise and expunge certain views that are deemed distasteful or wrong-headed, not by top judges or not by a bureaucratic elite or not by other politicians. So on this procedural understanding of all of the sort of what is morally or politically best questions are left to the voters. It's sort of founded on a basic trust in the sense of your fellow citizens, in the sort of good sense of your fellow citizens. That's what undergirds this procedural conception of democracy. There are few, if any, moral hurdles to be jumped over in addition to winning more votes. Now, the flip side of the procedural understanding of democracy, of seeing democracy without a lot of moral overlay, is that you recognize that democracy is not the only good thing in the world. You're not trying to stuff every moral good virtue you can under the aegis or umbrella of democracy. So sometimes you're going to dislike the results delivered by your fellow citizens. Sometimes democratic governments will do things that some people, occasionally many, of its citizens believe are, not rights respecting or not worthy. And other citizens will disagree with them. So realizing that democracy is purely a how to choose my government procedural concept feeds into the famous Churchillian understanding. Many of you will be well aware of Winston Churchill's famous aphorism or quip that democracy is the worst form of government, except for everything else we've ever tried. And the great man definitely included in those categories that were worse than democracy rule by unelected judges or rule by unaccountable bureaucratic elites. Not least because those other alternatives, you lack accountability. You can't throw the bums out, which was what the famous philosopher of science Karl Popper thought was the best part of democracy. You can throw people out. And so let me have a quick digression here. It's a related point. Churchill learned as brutally as any politician ever that you cannot expect gratitude from the voters. Here was the man who virtually single-handedly had kept Britain fighting, the man without whom it is hard to imagine Hitler being defeated, the man the great American pundit Charles Krauthammer picked as the greatest human being of the 20th century, and I would pick that. I agree with that choice. And yet in 1945, with the war in Europe over, the British electorate threw the man out of office. And yes, Churchill did go on to win the prime ministership again in 1951. And yes, when we look back today at that 45 Labour-Attlee government, it's big spending, big government, pro-unions, nationalizing the health service. And, it seems to have initiated policy settings that today seem to have been even worse than Churchill voters in 45 might have feared. But my point here is that voters in democracies do not always get it right. And by that I mean all of us at different times will think that our fellow voters have screwed up. But returning to the procedural understanding, notice that it sees democracy as a function of majoritarianism, shuns the morally bloated, rejects cramming the concept full of every worthy, supposedly substantively good outcome on offer, and this procedural conception fits in pretty well with the observable fact about the world, namely that smart, nice, pleasant people you'd happily share a beer with, happen to disagree on virtually all substantive moral and political issues: how to deal with illegal immigrants, who should be able to marry, how to structure the economy, whether murderers and rapists ought to be able to vote. The list is endless. And it's just a fact that people who are as smart and nice as you will differ in the answers they give to at least some of those issues. I was out at dinner last night with John and a few other people. I didn't agree with everything some of the other people said. fact of the world. And at this point, some people make a big mistake. They think you can live in a Spike Lee world. Now, Spike Lee is a famous American director. He made a lot of movies. But his most famous movie was titled Do the Right Thing. And quite a few people seem to assume or suppose that if we just all imposed a do the right thing mandate, we could just get on with it. That can never work because people simply and observably don't agree about what is right. And there is no science-like double-blind drug trial test that will deliver those answers. And that, at the heart of the matter, is why the older understanding of democracy is procedural. It's let the numbers count. It's also why we need law, by the way, because law is not just there to coordinate behavior, which side of the road should we drive on? It's also there to resolve these sincerely held disagreements. So, by the way, when I talk to senior judges around the Anglosphere, I do this fairly regularly. One of my favorite things is to point out to them that the decision-making rule on any top court, anywhere in the common law world, is a wholly procedural one. Here's what the rule is. 5 votes on the U.S. Supreme Court or the Canadian Supreme Court or the UK Supreme Court beats 4 votes. And it doesn't matter a whit or a tittle if the dissenting minority judgment is full of timeless moral truths. It's full of references to John Stuart Mill and the ICCPR, and it embodies every timeless human insight that has ever been discovered, while the majority judgment is trite, factually wrong, and written by the law clerks the day after a boozy night out on the town. 5 beats 4. Full stop. Top courts are the most brutally majoritarian institutions going. And boy, oh boy, do I enjoy pointing that out to the judges, and they don't like it. And so the only difference between a legislature and a top court in terms of how decisions are ultimately made is the size of the franchise. 18 million, 330 million versus 9. And that takes me to the second understanding of the concept of democracy. This one's growing up in the last 30-odd, 40-odd years. And you can think of it as the morally pregnant conception. So in this one, and it is loved by most judges, most top bureaucrats, the Davos elites, and basically this understanding insists on seeing democracy in more than just procedural terms. So it's more than just how you pick governments. You need to build in substantive content. So on this second, newer, morally laden understanding, you can call it a fat conception, and the first one's a thin one. You do all the things the procedural account rejects. You insist that a government is only democratic if it also meets certain moral tests, if it's sufficiently rights-respecting, if it enables citizens to pursue the good life, if it refrains from breaching the rule of law. You get the idea. Merely winning an election is not enough to qualify. That's what they assert. Now, to put my cards on the table, I am wholly in the procedural, old-fashioned account. I've written about this lots of times in all sorts of journals, but I think the older, thin conception is better. And it's because it's better to be able to say, this government is a democratic one, but in this particular instance, I think it's breached people's rights. That's better than to say, this government's not democratic, and leave all of us to work out that that is because the speaker happens to believe that rights have been infringed. So I think it's good to try to avoid shoving every good, human thing we can think of into our understanding of democracy, to make it a all-encompassing virtue or placeholder. Because again, it is an undeniable fact that smart, reasonable people do not agree about good things and how they ought to be realized. Now, having said which understanding I prefer, let me tell you again, for the purposes of tonight, you're just going to have to take my word for this, but the vast preponderance of common law judges around the democratic world prefer the fat, morally laden understanding of democracy. I don't know enough about the civil law systems to tell you about that. I do think that the claims I'm making would apply to the Strasbourg ECHR court or the Luxembourg ECJ court. Like the common law judges, most of them like the fat, morally pregnant understanding. Think of it this way. Imagine an unelected set of judges invalidating a statute passed by the elected legislature. Now, there may be defensible reasons for that. But one thing we can all see is that on the first understanding of democracy, what the committee of ex-lawyer judges is doing in striking down a statute is not democratic. Might be able to justify it on other grounds, but it's not democratic. All the early American writers on strong judicial review conceded that point. And then many of them found, or tried to find, they found diverse ways to try, and I emphasize try, to defend this counter-majoritarian action by the judges. It is a mightily tough task that leaves many of us, it leaves me, unconvinced. But notice what happens if you adopt a fat, morally pregnant conception of democracy. Because then it's as though you've been transported to the Vegas Strip and you find yourself watching a Penn and Teller magician's show. Because what happens is you transmogrify, or you shift what the judges have done from being anti-democratic and therefore in need of some kind of justification into an action that is simply upholding democracy. Poof. It's magic. These unelected elites just claim that the moral standards they have upheld or imposed actually are required by democracy, by their own fat, morally pregnant conception. And notice that the unelected elites do not need to be judges, although they're the biggest sinners, but they can be a bureaucratic elite doing it, one that operates in the name of a supranational organization. I don't know, one whose initials rhyme with, Me Too. I thought someone would get that. Let me give you a concrete example. Israel and its top court. Over the last 3 decades, the top Israeli judges have started playing fast and loose with any and all legal texts. And let me just be clear, I think I'm the most pro-Israeli law professor in Australia, but their top court has gone off the rails. They have made up wholly unconstraining interpretive approaches. They have transformed the country from being a parliamentary sovereignty jurisdiction like Britain, like New Zealand, where unelected judges have no power to invalidate statutes that have been passed by the democratically elected legislature. And why don't they have that power? Because they don't have a written constitution. They don't have any legal text to point to. They have no basis for striking it down. And they've turned it into something else that nobody can really actually describe. It's this transmogrified bootstrapping something else is a jurisdiction whose judges simply made themselves the overseers of what governments could do, and they don't even have to justify it by pointing to a legal text because there isn't one. So Israel's judges have bootstrapped themselves to have more second-guessing power, I think, more power to invalidate statutes than the judiciaries have in Canada and the U.S. Let that sink in. Let that sink in with a written constitution that arguably gives them the power. And how do the top judges and lawyers in Israel justify this judicially redrawn constitutional settlement? The judges in Israel simply say they're following the rule of law and democracy. They redefine what it means, the rule of law and democracy. They stuff both of them full of moral content, meaning the substantive end goals that these judges themselves happen to prefer, even when a majority of voters often disagree with the judges, as they do on many of the cases in Israel, they just say, this is the democratic outcome. In this way, the rule of law simply becomes ruled by judges, while the fat, morally pregnant understanding of democracy that Israeli's judiciary, and let's be honest, is massively supported by the lawyerly caste from which judges are chosen. The Israeli top court has even given itself a veto on who can be appointed to the top court. It becomes, by definition, the democratic outcome. So letting the numbers count gives way to being told what the rights-respecting or morally best outcome is. But en route, any and all accountability for the decisions made by these unelected, unaccountable elites, it just goes away. That's the newer conception of democracy. It's nice work if you can get it. It even allows a constitutional court in Romania to cancel an election in the name of democracy. Isn't that remarkable? Notice as well how destructive this newer substantive understanding can be when it comes to understanding the big trend we see right now across the democratic world. And I refer to what is often by many labeled as populism, though it's hard to know what that label actually means other than, these are becoming really popular parties with the voters, and we elites don't really like that. Think of the success of political parties in Italy and Argentina, or the ones getting so many votes in the Netherlands and Denmark. Or recall that these sort of parties are near the top of the polls in Germany and France. Take a look at Britain. Nigel Farage's Reform Party is comfortably ahead in all the polls and is threatening to bring an end to the world's oldest continuously operating political party, the Conservative Party. As for the country where I work, Australia, the One Nation Party is a comparative newborn. It's a pretty recent party. It operates in a majoritarian voting system with preferential voting, which is basically a protection racket for the two established parties. And even so, this party was in the low single figures polling 8 months ago. Today it's leading the polls in 3 of the 6 states, and nationally is barely behind the left-wing Labour Party, with the long-established, quite famous right-of-centre Liberal Party having its votes being cannibalized by this new party. My point here is that if you try to understand what's happening politically across the democratic world, and you try to do it in terms that were first suggested by none other than our own John O'Sullivan, right here, you need implicitly to adopt a procedural understanding of democracy. So remember, John argues, and he rightly argues, I think, that we're seeing presently a contest around the democratic world between, on the one hand, what he calls illiberal democracy, which means policies a lot of voters like, often a majority of voters, but also those same policies are ones that many elites find to be distasteful, non-rights respecting, and so for them, illiberal. And on the other hand, what John calls undemocratic liberalism, meaning this time policies that are pushed by the elites because they think them morally good and liberal, but ones that majority of the population is more and more rejecting. It's a terrific and very insightful prism through which to understand what's happening. This illiberal democracy versus undemocratic liberalism. But it only can work if we explicitly adopt the old-fashioned procedural understanding of democracy. If we go with the view of the Israeli Supreme Court, and let's be honest, it's also the view of the top British judges, the top Canadian judges, top Australian judges, the top New Zealand judges. There's exceptions, obviously. That's just staying within the common law world, but it's also the view of, the preponderance of the bureaucrats in the EU. Well, if we go with that fat, morally laden understanding of democracy, then what the elites are doing does not involve sacrificing democracy to achieve what they see as liberal outcomes, because on this new, fat, morally bloated understanding, what the elites are pushing both liberalism and democracy. Meanwhile, what the elites see as populist parties, what they're doing, advocating, is both illiberal and undemocratic. Isn't that neat? Isn't that delightful? And perhaps it helps explain the desire to ban and censor these parties. So either way, the tension John highlighted, if you adopt a fat, morally laden understanding, it's just basically magicked away by redefining what is meant by democracy. And by the way, were there more time tonight, I could run the same argument in terms of what they're doing to the concept of the rule of law, effectively turning it into rule by unelected judges. And this is all being done by the same unelected elites who really do not have a full-blooded love of majoritarian politics. I'm being as kind as I can. So basically, the elites who in the US and Europe let in millions to tens of millions of illegals. The elites who, in my view, completely screwed up the COVID response by aping the thuggish lockdowns of the Chinese Communist Politburo. Why you would choose them to emulate, I don't know. The elites who have driven government spending and taxing far too high. The elites whose dalliance with multiculturalism has been an obvious failure. the elites who have caved into the transgender lobby and, laughably cannot say what a woman is, or who have succumbed to anti-merit diversity, equity, inclusion policies, it's no wonder that established long-term political parties are under all sorts of pressure, really, is it? So let me go back to the rise of these dissenting, or if you prefer, Reformation-type politicians, whom the legacy media labels as populists, and to my starting claim that elections do and should have consequences, a point, by the way, that was made in stark terms by none other than former U.S. President Barack Obama. Not sure he stuck with that view after he was out of office, but it's worth observing that when it comes to the success of populism, you don't always have to be talking about new political parties. So President Donald Trump in the United States is clearly a politician with what many elites would describe as populist leanings. But in the U.S. political system, so open primaries, it's presidential rather than parliamentary infrastructure, it's state-based foundations where, a Republican in New York or Maine will be a very different creature from one in Florida, Tennessee, or Wyoming. Well, that system can allow an outsider to come into one of the established long-term parties, win, and effectively largely take over that party without starting a new party. But what Donald Trump did in the U.S., you cannot do in a parliamentary Westminster democracy like Canada, Australia, or Britain. You can't be a long shot outsider and come in and do what was done there. In Britain, you need a whole new party. And you also need a charismatic politician, someone who's an outsider, believable on the one or two most important issues to the public, and that effectively describes Nigel Farage of Reform. People trust him. After 14 years of the Tories saying one thing and doing something else, they don't trust him anymore. It's like, if you went home to your wife and said, yes, I know I've cheated on you 5 times, dear, but this 6th time you can really trust me. Promise. And that's, by the way, I'm not speaking from personal experience here. I want to be clear, because this is recorded. And the leader of the One Nation Party in Australia fits into this category too. Now, people here in the audience will be more familiar than I am with the so-called populist parties around Europe. But it's not just Europe, and it's not just the countries I've talked about in the Anglosphere. The phenomenon extends to South America too. Most obviously, Argentina and Javier Milei. You can see it throughout South America. And, you'd have to be a quibbler and something of a, sophist to deny that Japan's newish prime minister, I can't even say her last name, Taikachi, Japan's first female prime minister as of, half a year ago, you probably wouldn't want to deny that she very loosely fits into this camp. And let me give you an aside. How many people in the room have noticed that a fair few of these populist politicians, the ones at the top of their parties, are women? And yet the legacy media has not prostrated itself in spasms of politically correct genuflecting to celebrate these women, not unless I've missed something. Maybe that's because the progressive left and the legacy media have such trouble even telling us what a woman is. Or maybe it's because they only celebrate successful women when they are women who agree with them. Second thing I should say here is, I would say that all these dissenting political parties and politicians, the ones labeled populists, they all want elections to count and to have consequences. They're happy to take their chances with letting the numbers count majoritarianism, a decision-making procedure by which elections have consequences. And it's because these parties want to make changes to immigration, to who can and can't come into the country, to the accepted consensus of the last 4 or 5 decades that multiculturalism works and that all cultures are equal, and against the woke belief that there's nothing special about Western culture that grew out of the Greek and Roman world, was then shaped by Judeo-Christian outlooks, including by the sometime bloody contest between the Catholic and Protestant versions of that worldview. Not to mention the fact that these parties want to fight the culture wars. They want to fight the culture wars. They want to take on the ludicrous notion that a man can become a woman just by self-identifying and wanting to be one. And by the way, that is a worldview that sits on the notion that one's desires and druthers trump, and one's feelings trump facts that are imposed on us by the external causal world. This idea that we can't offend and we have to let subjective feelings trump all, by the way, is also applied in an incredibly arbitrary way. If a 45-year-old said, look, I identify as a 12-year-old, so I want to play in the under-13 ice hockey championship, no one would let that happen. If a white woman says she self-identifies as a black one and wants to put on a bit of blackface and qualify for affirmative action benefits, we don't let that happen. I do not know what has happened on the transgender front. It's bizarre. It's like one of those 99-1 issues where a lot of politicians want to side with the one. So on these and a host of other issues, the so-called populists are in the camp that say elections most definitely should have consequences. These calls can't be left to decision makers who are unaccountable to the voters, your high-end bureaucrats, your international law lawyers, the heads of NGOs. It is unelected judges and, yes, high-level unelected bureaucrats and supranational bodies who are attracted to the idea of vetting election results. These are the people who sympathize with the setting up of guardian council type outfits to pick, acceptable parties. These non-majoritarian elites want you to understand democracy in this fat, morally laden sense. And as I've pointed out, we all know that what's morally best or most rights respecting or most in keeping with the good life is always and everywhere contested, debatable, and open to reasonable disagreement. We know it. The elites know it. Hence, they don't just want a fat, morally laden understanding of democracy. They also want that morally laden component to be arbitrated by them, by European Union luminaries, doyens, notables, or by the Israeli Supreme Court justices, or by British or Canadian top judges. All people drawn from a lawyerly caste whose political views, and now I'm just speaking about the English-speaking world, which I know about, are a standard of deviation or two to the progressive woke left. One of the most incredible things of the last 50 years is that 40, 50 years ago, again in the English-speaking world, judges and lawyers were to the right of the median voter. There's lots of social science evidence on this. Political donations are public information in the U.S. Today, the most politically correct woke workplaces you can find are big-ticket law firms. Go into a big law firm in Sydney and you better have your pronoun tattooed on your forehead. So one of the most surprising things are the lawyers have become at least one standard deviation, maybe two, to the left of the median voter. And who do we choose judges from? And does anyone think that law schools are becoming more sane? So we see this attitude daily in the United States when it comes to opponents of Donald Trump. Or take Germany and France and the idea of some sort of, excuse my pronunciation, cordon sanitaire around populist parties of the right that forces mainstream conservative parties to continually prefer governing with socialists. It's a slow-motion suicide pact, right? It's a guarantee of a slow, lingering demise for the established parties of the center-right. Each election, they lose more and more voters. Let me make clear, then I'm finishing now, that I'm proud to be a longtime supporter of majoritarian democracy. It's about half of what I've done professionally for 30 years. I'm firmly in the procedural, let the numbers count sort. So, Churchillian in terms of it's the worst form of government except for everything else anyone can suggest. And with the last few decades' performance of the traditional established parties, and especially those on the right, it's hardly surprising that new parties have risen up with nonconformist, maverick, heretical, apostate views. The fact those dissonant views are increasingly popular, ladies and gentlemen, is what established... the fact those dissonant views are increasingly popular, that, ladies and gentlemen, is what established hierarchies and long-established political parties dislike. But the great liberal philosopher John Stuart Mill would have welcomed unorthodox views and parties and the competition they bring to the table. And the great thing about the procedural view of democracy is it welcomes that competition too, because nothing is ever locked in beyond the next election. Any party is welcome to contest it with its own set of promised policies. And yet all of this is true, while it's also inevitable that on occasion there will be election results many people in a country really don't like and think is incredibly misguided. An unfortunate fact about the world, and I think probably an appropriate place to finish tonight. So thank you very much, and again, thank you to the Danube Institute.
Thank you so much, James. I think that was funny and entertaining. So bravo. And I know we're going to have a fabulously entertaining and funny panel. So Anna Willis, if you'll come and sit next to James.
I win.
Right next to James. Okay. And then John, if you'll seat yourself next to Anna. And our moderator, Pierre, if you shall come and take the first chair here. And we'll have a fabulous panel discussion guided by Pierre. As long as it's off. And the microphones are on. Once you just start speaking into them, they will capture your voice and speak directly into them.
Thank you very much, James, for your talk. So I would begin by saying thank you. And also, what do you think about the word democracy, which is not neutral at all? It carries a positive meaning, a positive connotation. If I'm saying this man is not a democrat, it's an insult. If I'm saying this man is not a king or this man is not a president, it's totally descriptive and neutral, which sometimes leads undemocratic institutions like the EU, which is an undemocratic structure because it's not based on the will of the people, it's based on treaties, to explain this state is not a democratic state because, for example, it doesn't respect the right of minorities, which is a part of political liberalism instead of being a part of democracy.
Well, two very brief things. Firstly, of course, you can use Democrat in a pejorative sense, but that's when you're talking about a particular political party in the U.S. Secondly, one of the reasons I think that there has been this move towards a morally fat understanding of democracy is because of the point that Pierre makes, that nobody wants to be on the side of not democracy. So we'll just redefine the term, and we can all claim to be within the broad tent of democracy.
I totally agree, and we can see like authoritarian state or even like dictatorship like North Korea, for example, or some country in Africa, which the real name is Democratic Country of, etc. Anna, do you have any thought about it?
Well, I'd like to, first about the EU being established or built on the foundation of treaties, I'd like to take serious issue with it. One of the most incredible things is that it's a construct that gives itself constantly new rights, new competences, and to your point about moral outrage or moral matrix in some ways being a defining feature, that is definitely what we have. And I think the word democratic, well, I'll just, it's the pretty astounding thing is that at the top of the European Union, there are people who have never been elected. And they are arbiters of the integrity with which the elections they watch are conducted and arbiters of democratic behavior. It's really quite extraordinary.
Thank you, John.
Thank you. Well, I am very interested in the democratic credentials, which are exiguous, if they exist at all, of the European Union, because, for example, legislation, in order to be passed by the European Parliament, and it doesn't have that much power, that has to be essentially proposed by the Commission, itself an undemocratic body, which means that the Commission has, in effect, an advance veto on European legislation. And that's extremely dangerous now, because it effectively means that a lot of things that the majority might want to pass, they never get the opportunity to do so. Now, I don't object to it quite so strongly as otherwise might, because I think that the European Parliament is not, in a sense, Parliament like the Hungarian Parliament or the British Parliament or whatever. It doesn't represent a common and united, a common viewpoint or common viewpoints in the society. The election, a European election held in Hungary, is quite different to the same European election held in Sweden, which is itself different to the same European election held in Ireland or Malta or whatever. That is to say, there is not, throughout the whole of Europe, a common democratic conversation in which everybody knows the meanings of words and what's on the table and so on. The European Parliament is much more like an international, well, it is to some extent an international organization, like the UN, in which ambassadors from particular countries arrive to represent their viewpoint. But that's not the same thing as a democratic debate. Now, I think there are other points I'd like to make, but maybe later.
Actually, if I may add one thing, because when we talk about democracy, and we've just all been watching elections here, just one thing, it's a complete misunderstanding to look at Europe as a place where the democratic process is supposed to take place. And because this is, I think, at the heart of the disagreement that was so poorly, this will sound condescending, but so poorly understood here, that is where we start the problem. Since when do we have a democratic process whereby countries would impose their will legally onto other countries? This is at the heart of it. This is the land of the veto. I mean, that is the only reason why, after each country voting the 50 times that it took for each of them to join the European Union, they eventually joined, because they were told, hey, you'll be able to tell the rest of us to shove it if you don't like something, and we will never coerce you in any way, because there is no way the European Union would have been created if anybody told the Dutch that count your people, compare yourself to Germany, and then, good luck to you. That is just not what happened. And suddenly we're living in the place in which Mrs. von der Leyen, famous for, her own national corruption scandals, and the fact that she's, second or third generation living off of taxpayers' money, and never being elected to anything, always being placed in various positions, is telling the rest of Europe that there is somehow this pan-European democratic process.
Exactly. Yeah. Excuse me.
Just two brief things. So I spent the early part of my academic career in Hong Kong before the handover, and the British had, overtly and openly set up a parliament that really was not, they didn't even pretend it was democratic and had very limited powers. And someone did a comparison of the pre-handover Hong Kong Parliament to the EU Parliament, and almost every count, the Hong Kong one had more input, more say, and was what we would loosely call more democratic. The other thing is, nobody wants to hear someone go on about what judges are doing. It's the fastest way to cure insomnia. But if you set up a jurisdiction that's federal, normally you'll set up a court, and the court's job is to police the division of power between the center and the regions. If you want a court that always and everywhere sides with the center, it's the European Court of Justice. Some of their decisions, Anna's totally right, it's not the founding treaties. They just ignore that, and every chance they get, they just hand more and more and more power to the center. And when it's done by the, well, to themselves too, but when that's done by the official, supposedly neutral umpire arbiter who's policing the division of powers, you really have no remedy.
Yes, John?
Well, I was going to say, if you have a body like the EU, which is 27 different countries, there are two ways, really, of passing laws and regulations. And let me describe the two ways. One is for the central body to say, everyone agrees we've got to do something about improving the railways or something. or everybody wants to have a different, a slightly more liberal divorce rate. So let's pass a general resolution saying that. Then you go back to the parliaments and they say, well, we can actually reject the whole idea if we feel like it, but most of the time we don't feel like doing that. So we in this House will debate what is the best reform of, let us say, divorce legislation or environmental legislation or whatever. And then on the basis of the general desire to improve things, each country would, each democratic parliament would shape that legislation. The other way to doing it is the way the EU does it now, really, which is to have a central committee which includes ministers from different countries, agreeing on a legislation which will be common throughout the 27 countries. Inevitably, that legislation that comes through from that single committee will be much less sensitive to local needs and not just local needs, but local circumstances in a broader category. And therefore, what you have, and so what they call harmonization of legislation and of regulations, produces results which do not suit, let us say, half or a quarter or of all of these institutions. But it's been so difficult to get the agreement of 27 countries to this one regulation that it becomes almost impossible to get it reversed or whatever. Now, the question at the end of this you must ask yourself is this. Do you believe that citizens should be able to get together to organize to repeal or amend a law? Of course, we'd all say yes. In Britain, in France, in Germany, that is a practical possibility. It's not a practical possibility when the rules are laid down for the 27 countries by one body.
Thank you very much. I would like to discuss now a bit about judicial review. You mentioned judicial review during your talk. So, as you know, it was a coup made by the judicial power because the US Constitution didn't provide for any judicial review. During the debate, about the Constitution, Madison wanted a right of veto for unconstitutionality to the judiciary. Hamilton was in favor of it, but finally it was in the famous decision Marbury versus Madison in 1803 when the US Supreme Court gave itself this power. So what do you think, like nowadays, in modern democracy, about the rise of judicial power, the power of the court? You use the example of Romania, for example. Almost the same happened in France. So what do you think about the power of judges today in modern democracies?
Can I just say, and I'm not a lawyer, by the way, so,
That's what we like about you.
Yeah, I'm full of judgment, though. I just want to say one thing. In the US, you cannot do what the Europeans do and what is happening to Israelis with their judges. You cannot just say, I think I'd like to tell you that you can't do it. There has to be somebody who has to put a case together. We had 50 cases against the 2020 elections. None of them made it to any court on merit. So it's not that easy. But for the Supreme Court to vote against something, they cannot decide we feel like ruling on it. Nobody has any interest unless it has pragmatic consequences about something that we are disagreeing about at the moment, and that meets, three very particular set of circumstances that gives the Supreme Court the right to even rule. So I just want to say it because you used, an idea from the US for something that's happening here. What's crazy here is that you really don't need anybody to justify anything. You can say, theoretically speaking, do you think I can marry my German Shepherd? Yes, I think you do. I mean, that is nuts. You can create a theoretical universe, and the rest of us have to live in it.
When it comes to marrying your German Shepherd, you don't want to be dogmatic about it. Okay, so let me say this. Thank you. When it comes to the U.S., you have to be very, very careful in terms of trying to generalize from their judicial review. So yes, Madison did not want to have, he didn't even want to have a Bill of Rights. The first Madisonian Constitution, it was forced on them in order to get it through the vote. But also, when they are talking about judicial review, they're talking about federalism review, right? The Bill of Rights doesn't apply to the central government until after the Civil War. And federalism review is where a judge looks at a smaller elected body and a big one and picks, right? Now that is structurally different, saying, you pick one and whichever one you pick can do anything. That's structurally different than rights-related review, which says no politicians in the country can do something. That doesn't kick off to the federal government till after the Civil War. And if we're being honest, there's no real judicial activism or striking down statutes of Congress until Oliver Wendell Holmes after the First World War. It just doesn't happen, and it doesn't really go crazy till the 60s. And so, the Americans are not an example of 200 years of wild judicial activism. And then applying it to other places, well, most modern bills of rights, which trigger most of the problem, have very virulent equality provisions. And if you give modern day judges competing rights, and one of them is, say, the right to free speech or the right to freedom of assembly, and the other one is the right to equality, I can tell you, and this is not 100% generalization, but very close, they will always pick the right to equality, which is why Canada has the most powerful right to free speech, and Australia, with no Bill of Rights, has far more scope for people to speak their mind. Is because the right to free speech in Canada does nothing. And so you have to be very careful to generalize from the U.S. to anywhere where they've got a Bill of Rights or a rights-related provision post-1970. They're not the same. You can't generalize between them. We would all love to adopt the U.S. First Amendment jurisprudence, but you can't.
John, if you have it.
Well, I just agree with what my two colleagues have said on that. I don't have anything particular to say.
Okay, thank you. Montesquieu, the founder of political liberalism, spoke about the ability to act and to prevent, what it's called in the US a check and balances. Don't you think, like today, by developing out of the fear of dictatorship, counterpower to action, the power to prevent became greater than the power to act, which can explain the right of abstention, because one of the first political party in Europe is the abstention. People are not going to vote, maybe because the people are not believing the power is really in the hand of legitimate government.
I've been married 40 years, so I've sort of lost the fear of autocracy and dictatorship because you play along long enough. So there are problems with voting rates, right? I don't know, the American turnout at presidential elections is about 60% if you're lucky. In Canada, we used to laugh at the Americans. When I was growing up, we'd get it in the 80s, 85. It's now in the low 50s. They deserve what they get in Canada. The only country I can think of with voluntary voting, Australia has compulsory voting, so you get in the 90s. But New Zealand has voluntary voting, and they still get high 80s, but that's very, very unusual. And there's all sorts of, the one thing I don't want to do is do social science speculation, because I don't really believe they ever get anything right. But who knows why there's this lethargic sort of indifference, but we have to fix it. It would be nice to fix it.
I'm not avoiding. There is some part that's very down to earth about what's happening in Europe that I'm interested in. And as much as we could parse the issues as legal issues, I think it's really important not to lose sight of the fact that this isn't just, we don't just have in Europe an argument about what way should we live, what people should be allowed to do or not allowed to do. There are two things. One, there definitely is a difference between who says what. Germany's constitutional court can say that their constitution is above the law of the continent. Now, if Poland says it, they'll be crucified. Quite literally, with all the humiliations of the Lord's passion along the way. So one of the things, what I'm afraid of is that in some of the legal divagations, we lose sight of the fact that I really believe that national interest did not disappear because this continent gained the name Union. There is a extremely visible, like impossible to miss phenomenon of empire by other means. So, you know, it's not hypocrisy, it's hierarchy, would be sort of the way to explain it. So some make the rules, and that includes defining or not defining who is a woman or whatever, to divide, to weaken, and to straighten out. I mean, one of the things that happen when we undermine all the categories, when we have the center define everything, is that what gets lost in this attempt to privilege the individual, privilege the self that we now know can be at war with itself. You know, it thinks it's a woman when it's a guy. I mean, that's a pretty amazing stage of privileging the individual and individual self. But meanwhile, what's actually happening is that as we celebrate identity, we are in the process very methodically, not chaotically, undermining true identity. Most people feel like something. There is a place they really like. There are songs that make them cry or laugh. There is a way in which they relate to men or women, to their children, to their language, to books they read, and to the country they live in, and on and on. And those are very organic, very powerful ways in which we learn who we are from when we're very little until, you know, we drop dead. But, and in order to somehow be absorbed into this huge union and not rebel against it, all those things, national identity, tradition, language, things that move you, that make you laugh, that depress the heck out of you, they have to be beaten out of you, because otherwise, whatever is the predominant interest of the center, you will naturally, physically rebel against. And we're not supposed to. Look at Hungary.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, not because I don't appreciate Montesquieu, but I just...
I want to suggest that
He was a judge.
under conditions of multiculturalism, we get a really serious confusion between two completely different conceptions of the words, the terms majority and minority. In everyday language of recent years, the word in elections, majority and minority, those terms are as changeable and as shifting as a kaleidoscope. In every election, the majority is composed of different people from different groups, and so is the minority. What multiculturalism does is it takes the words minority and majority and says, no, these are fixed categories. They're ethnic categories sometimes. They are sometimes sexual categories. There might be national categories. But those are relatively fixed. I mean, if they're sexual categories, I mean, I know there are some people who say they're not, but I would say they mostly are fixed. Whereas, you know, the people who, if you look at electoral statistics seriously, and you look at who votes left and right, the composition of those two categories changes dramatically. And that's important, in fact, because there will be different majorities and minorities if the topic is different. And so we won't all feel that we are each other's enemies all the time, because I'm on the same side as you in one controversy, and we're on different sides in another. And wise political arrangements will have constituencies in which you have a mix of people, so that their representatives, in talking to them, try to persuade them to cohere and to agree on things, rather than saying, well, we know exactly how many people here are black, how many are white, how many are Chinese, and so on. So we don't really have to talk about it, do we? We just add the numbers up. And if you look at constitutional arrangements, the most famous one is that of Lebanon, in which you have confessional categories which are fixed. The problem is, or Northern Ireland, within a few years, that they're no longer valid because the number of Christians in Lebanon shrank and the number of Muslims in Lebanon increased. And the arrangements of the constitution, rather than solving or ameliorating the problems of ethnic difference, they made it worse because you now have a new grievance to add to any other grievances that were already there. So, I mean, I think this is a really major point which is generally not considered. But in a progressive society, change is constant, says Disraeli, and that means you want to have electoral arrangements that are very flexible too.
In Lebanon, they had a civil war, when they wanted to count again how many Christians, etc.
Well, I think I've said what I was searching around for something. I agree with everything I've just heard, but I was searching for something optimistic for Anna. And I guess what you could say is the Germans are doing everything they can to destroy their economy, so they might not be such a behemoth in 10 years.
Yeah.
Thank you. That was very helpful.
You spoke about Germany, according
so you
to...
thought that was the empire I had in mind by other names? I didn't say it. I was careful.
No, could have been the French.
According to the German constitution, the first articles of the constitution can't change. So, according to the title of this conference, when the question of election is linked to the question of sovereignty, who is the real sovereign? Who has the final word? Who has the final say? In Germany, for example, I won't say like the will of the people is above all, because according to the constitution, you can't change the first articles. So at the end, the final say will be for the judge. So is it correct to say, for example, in Germany, the sovereign will be the judge and not the people anymore?
Absolutely. The whole problem with the concept of judicial review, for example, is that this won't settle anything in a way. If you don't like the judge's decision, what you're going to have, as, for example, the American people didn't like it, sufficiently like it anyway, in the case of abortion, then you will have 40 or 50 years in which abortion becomes one of the major questions in every political election. And when people are choosing judges, the judges are quizzed, and they always try to avoid answering the questions clearly about what their attitude on abortion is. And that should, we should not have that kind of politics as the basis of our constitutional arrangements. Just to add a quote here, Lee Kuan Yew, and he had great experience in creating institutional arrangements that were extraordinarily successful in a multi-ethnic community. He said once you have a multicultural society, then you, in a sense, democracy becomes impossible. Or to put it a different way, you cannot have free discussion, and you have to place limitations on what the elected politicians can do, because the cause of harmony has to be enforced by a strong government. And that doesn't seem to me to be the best way of running a society.
Thank you, John. James, you wanted to add something?
What was the question, the original question?
It was about, the original question was about Germany, because it is written in the constitution, you can't change it.
So
election matters or not?
Sovereign.
Yeah,
Who is
I want
sovereign?
to give you an example of judicial review in the common law English-speaking world, because the ideal we have is that the judges are more or less impartial. That's the only thing that really makes the system work. And we don't talk in the English-speaking world about bias. We talk about the appearance of bias. So it doesn't matter if anyone's biased, if it looks biased. So let me just put aside what you think about Brexit. The two main Brexit cases, there are 14 members of the UK Supreme Court in each case, and every single one of them was either known or assumed or thought to be Remainers. On the first one, Miller 1, had to do with prerogative power. the judges overturned 200 years of precedent to give a result that made it harder for Boris Johnson to bring about Brexit. And then in the second one, Miller 2, which was about proroguing Parliament, because, and by the way, in Canada, Justin Trudeau prorogued Parliament, Stephen Harper prorogued Parliament. Parliament had been prorogued many times in Britain. The judges said you can't prorogue Parliament because that would have made getting Brexit easier, and again, 14 years. So the idea that these judges are just sort of neutral, disinterested, they blew that completely up. Now, in the end, they didn't even achieve what they wanted. They did a little, but nothing like what they wanted to. And so that's a real problem. You know, judicial review stops commanding much respect if it looks like you cannot, as a judge, decide against your own first-order preferences. Bad.
If I may very quickly, just a comment on something John said about minorities and majorities and the Pantare aspect of it all. I think it may be useful to start using phrases protected classes, unprotected classes, two-side issues, and issues that only have one side. Because I think in practice, the emotional universe, because it's not even moral universe. This isn't like Thomas Aquinas and, you know, just delighted in his grave when he watches us. That this is not a moral universe. It's an emotive universe. And it also will bring us, if we need a segue to what just happened 2 days ago, I'm just offering one. It brings us to a place where democracy is good and populism is bad. So what happened with instead of minority majority, if we have a protected class or protected opinion and unprotected class, well, we know that if you stand against the protected group, and if majority does, that's populism. It's populism, it's not legitimate. It doesn't matter if it's a 90-10 issue. If you think a family needs a father and a mother and it produces children, that is not supposed to be a majority opinion. That is, in fact, the unprotected opinion that should be defeated because it will probably hurt somebody's feelings down the road. And issues that are one-side issues would be, is the fact that we have lungs and we emit CO2 good for the plants, or are we destroying the planet? It would be, you know, can we use fossil fuels? Is it? I mean, you know, I think that is really the issue, and that is where judges come in with incredible brutality, relative eloquence, but such painfully unsocratic, like classical fallacy after fallacy sort of judgments, and they put it in writing, which is incredible. And then we just get a verdict. We just get a judgment. Yeah. So anyway, I just think that's the weirdness of the universe in which we are. And when you were saying the judges are now, you know, to the left of the structure in which they stand, like literally on the outside of it, that is really a problem.
Yeah. Only going to get worse. Thank you, Anna. And I totally agree when you say the judge has to be impartial. You are going in front of a judge precisely because you believe this is an impartial third party. When the judge is going into the political field, speaking about immigration, the death penalty, abortion, bioethic, and so on.
All one-side issues.
Yes, he is not impartial anymore. Let's take a hypothetical example. You are on a bus with your child is screaming, and someone came inside the bus to slap your child. Maybe this is a good decision. However, this decision was made by an illegitimate third party, yet no parents will accept that the education of children has to be made by this kind of illegitimate third party. So when there are disagreement in society, it should be settled by election through referendum or by the parliament, because judges are not responsible in front of the people. They are mostly appointed, not elected. So it's really weird that the major debates in democratic society are made by unelected judges. maybe this is the moment to open the floor, for the discussion. But John, you have something to add?
Well, I was just going to make one very simple point, which applies across the board here, which is this, that one of the problems of modern society, not only multiculturalism and electoral arrangements, but the fashion for niceness and softness, is that the criticisms we used to find in literature, in literary criticism, in classical criticism, in law, were, among other things, very bracing. They were sharp, and so on. And my favorite example of that is, I think it was A. Hausman, who began a review in one case by listing all of the errors that the writer had written in this book, and then ended by saying, a moment's thought would have saved Professor so-and-so from this catalogue of errors. But thought is a painful process, and a moment is a long time. And a similar case in cultural questions. Senator Phil Graham was questioning a Health and Human Services bureaucrat in the Senate. And the Senate and the bureaucrat said, Senator, I can assure you that I love your children every bit as much as you do. And Graham said, oh, really? What are their names? So, I mean, now that kind of slicing through the nonsense and getting to the point is something that used to be, I think, one of the glories of, well, I'm thinking here, obviously, of English, American, and Anglosphere life. And by the way, I don't doubt that it exists very strongly in Hungarian culture too. But that it seems to me that we are very reluctant now to engage in that kind of, well, destructive criticism.
I'm very happy to hand over, but I feel like I have this need to actually land in the elections place, because they just happened. And the only reason why I'm in Budapest was because I was co-chairing this mission to be here and observe the elections. And I think that's kind of a big deal, because that's in the context of what we're talking about. That's sort of the heart of it all. And speaking of legality and illegality of things, it actually, and speaking of judicial review and in-judicial review, some pretty stunning things were happening here. And one of the most incredible things is that the two parties had every article described each candidate consistently across the board in the same way. One was a Democrat, a pro-EU conservative. I really like that. There are books in the US now that say that Barack Obama is a conservative, not a joke. I'm not kidding. It's a nice thing. It means that leftist is now a dirty word, and that's a glorious thing. Anyway, and the other one was always described as right-wing, autocrat, probably won't leave power. And then the behaviors of the two candidates, speaking of judicial review, it is incredible, actually, what was not reviewed, not commented on, and we pretended that the person who had most of the world and the kitchen sink against him was the one who had an unfair advantage. Again, I did nothing but watch what was happening here for a while, because I promised that I would. And it is quite extraordinary how much stuff that's illegal took place. If you call me out and say, tell me what, I'll tell you, but I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. Is there any question from the audience? Yes? The microphone is coming for the gentleman here.
Tell us who you are, and let's take a question.
Stephen Nagy from the International Christian University in Tokyo. I was struck by both James and John. You mentioned, John, you were talking about definitions, and I find this, I'm based in East Asia. I've been there for 30 years. I speak the languages. And when we talk about conservatism, we talk about democracy. it's interpreted completely different in that part of the world. Japan is very much a consensus-based approach to democracy and thinking about issues, and the judicial process thinks about how society would think about the decision, not just about law. Korea is very much an advocacy-based kind of civil society, and they advocate, and it shapes the decisions of the judicial process. So very, very different. So I'm wondering, John, if you can comment about the challenges of definitions of democracy and rule of law and judgment. And for James, I was also struck by this idea that the judicial process and judges have turned to the left. And I think this is indicative of universities. I think it's indicative of our schools. I think it's indicative of many different aspects of our society. So I'm wondering if you can comment on how we can pull us out of this hole. How can we dig us out of this hole? Because when a judicial process is already biased, no longer it provides the judgment that helps us.
Well, I'll do my half first, so John can do his half second. So we had this constitutional referendum in Australia, which effectively was trying to alter the constitution to put in a special body that would be really run by whoever the elites chose to represent the Aboriginals, which are a very small percentage of the population in Australia. And luckily, the Australian constitution can only be changed by a vote. It's the one part where Australia has the most American constitution in the world, but they didn't like the amending formula, and so they don't ask the political class, they ask the voters. Well, it got slaughtered, 61-39, but there are 38 law schools in Australia, and you could count on one machine operator's hand how many law professors came out against this. 4. I was one, and I know the other 3. Right, on Brexit, I was on sabbatical in the UK. You could not find a person in a law school who would openly say they were for Brexit. I would because I was visiting, but a couple would come up to me and say, yeah, I agree with you, but I'd lose my job if I said anything. Now, it is worse on progressive issues, like anything to do with sex and the problem is that law schools are only getting worse. They just had a survey of Yale University, and not a single person in the entire university faculty, so not just law, said that he or she was a Trump-supporting Republican. 0. There are whole parts of universities in the English-speaking world where there are no self-identifying conservatives. Engineering's a little better, mathematics is a little better, but by and large, even those ones aren't. And so if you think you're going to have graduates from law schools in 20 years who are a better pool of candidates from which so in the English-speaking world, you work as a lawyer, and then from that pool of lawyers, you're chosen to be a judge. Well, the pool's getting worse and worse. In Australia, it's almost impossible to find an interpretively conservative woman. You can still find a few men. It's almost impossible to find an interpretively conservative woman. Which is compounded by the fact that our right-of-center politicians feel that, every second pick they have to pick a woman. I don't have any optimistic answer to this one, really. The populist parties are just going to come in and blow the whole thing up, and I'm sort of moving that way.
Thank you, John.
On the question of interpretation of words, I think one of the reasons why we should want decisions to be taken as closely as possible to the people, more in nations than in international organizations, more in towns and villages than in parliaments, is that the meaning of words very often changes significantly when we cross a boundary of some kind. The obvious one is the term equity, which means one thing, and which means in America at the moment, it means a kind of supercharged version of equality. And I think in English law, it means something completely different, a flexible approach to try to find what is the fairest solution in any particular case. So it's very important that, in a sense, we have that we keep as many decisions as possible close to the smallest community. Now, that's one of the principles allegedly enshrined in European Union law. But then there's an interesting twist. Who decides which decisions should be interpreted by the small communities or by the big parliaments? Why, it's the European Union bureaucracy. So they almost never say, we want this decision transferred back downwards. They almost always bring it up to themselves. And that, it seems to me, is we cannot possibly seriously discuss in a general way what's the word I want here? The best method for the best locus for decisions without taking self-interest into account. And as the man who invented the term the end, what's it? Not the end of the world, the end of history, said. He said, look, the Europeans and the Americans have a different view on where the decision, on where legitimacy comes from. The Americans think, well, it obviously starts with the people, and they lend legitimacy upwards to Parliament, and they lend legitimacy upwards to the federal government, and they lend legitimacy upwards, lend, not give, to the UN. And the Europeans say, well, no, legitimacy is up there in the ether, above the clouds, and that lends legitimacy downwards. And then, of course, what's his name? I'm sorry, I've slipped his end of history.
Fukuyama.
Frank said, the problem is that it's very, very easy for elites to decide that, of course, legitimacy is up there in the clouds because they're the people who decides what the clouds think.
Yeah.
And so I completely agree with James's general argument about thick and thin definitions of democracy, but I just think there are far too many supporting evidence for his argument than I think very few arguments, supporting arguments for the other.
May I add something to what you said? Because subsidiarity kind of does exist, but it usually exists in countries that have the correct opinions, and then they're allowed to decide. There are various cases in their own courts. When it comes to Hungarians, when it comes to the Poles, you go straight to the European Court of Justice, and the European Court of Justice, that's not supposed to allow it. They're supposed to force you to go through the legal process because of the principle of subsidiarity as close to home, as you suggest, as possible. They simply arbitrarily say, well, you have that autocrat in power, so naturally you can come to the bosom of the European Court of Human Rights or the European Court of Justice, and Luxembourg or whatever will surely or Strasbourg will decide. So, and that's exactly that's the rub, because these are the issues that really need to be decided. Somebody who's in an absolute minority cannot be allowed, which the European Union encourages, to lord it over all of his or her people by jumping over their heads to a guy in a toga.
No, I'm just going to
With all due
say,
respect, toga wearers.
there is as everyone in the Eastern Europe knows, there is a cost to centralism, even if it's soft centralism. And so I used to know these numbers off the top of my head. I don't, but more or less what I'm about to say is right. So 25 years ago, Europe was almost as wealthy as the U.S. Now it's barely over half. I mean, the Americans have a dynamic economy. They send decision-making down. They even had different rules during COVID, or, there's zero state tax in Florida, Texas, Alaska, New Hampshire. California and New York have massively high state taxes, which are added to the central taxes. There's only two countries in Europe that are richer than the U.S. and one is Ireland, which lives off American companies moving there to get the 12% tax rate, which the EU is trying to crush. It would only take President Trump to decide he doesn't like this anymore, and Ireland's finished. And the other one's not in the EU, Switzerland, although it abides. So all-encompassing centralism, soft centralism, not like pre-Berlin Wall centralism, has a massive cost in terms of how you perform economically. You can pretend it doesn't, but the advantage of federalism is nothing to do with if anyone talks about cooperative federalism, they don't understand why it works. Competitive federalism, where you give people different possible outcomes. So you satisfy more preferences by driving the decision down, but you also create competition, and people can decide whether they want to live in a high tax and supposedly high service economy like New York, or they want to move to Texas. And it turns out that, New York is not high. It's high tax, but you don't get a lot of high service. New York actually spends more per homeless person than the median wage. And the money doesn't go to homeless people. It goes to massively highly paid bureaucrats who don't fix anything. Now, people are starting to realize this. The brain drain, my entire life, California was a net inflow of people. In the last 5 years, they're massively losing people. And so is New York.
Congressman.
Yeah. There will be a cost to pay for this in the EU. The idea that you're just going to have this one homogenized global, it is not economically efficient. It does not deliver economically. It might deliver in other fronts, but it will not deliver economically long term.
Thank you, James. Let's take another question in the back, and then the last one here. Yes.
Thank you very much for this very enlightening discussion. As a representative of the German embassy, I feel compelled to make just two comments, factual ones. One, I think, was the wish from the panel that Germany's economy might keep declining. I hope it's not declining, and there is one of the things we agreed very much on with Mr. Orban's government was actually that given the fact that Hungary's economy and Germany's are so much intertwined, I think that would not be a good idea for Hungary too. So that was my first point. The second one on Germany's constitution. Indeed, there is a part of the constitution which is declared to be not changeable by parliament. It's basically enshrined in one sentence: human dignity must not be violated. We put it into our constitution because we had a guy, Adolf Hitler, who came through procedural democracy, unfortunately, into power. And the first thing he changed was with understanding, declaring communists, Jews, whatever, to have no dignity and thus no protection under German law. So I think, if you ask German people nowadays which of our institutions have the highest trust, it's usually our constitutional court. And this is across the board, from the AfD, from the very right to the very left. So I think that's also maybe just interesting to register. Thank you very much, otherwise.
Thank you.
Hello, my name's Robert Greenfield. I used to live here in Budapest, came here to the Danube quite often. I came back from France, where I live now, for this election. First thing I want to say, thank you to John and Melissa O'Sullivan. They have done an absolute brilliant job over the years, and we should all thank them. And nobody knows about the future, but I think, could we give them a little bit of a hand here to say thank you to the two of them? I want to particularly thank John for his intellectual side and his ability to try to cross over all of these things. I have heard him talk about the Anglosphere a dozen times or more, and he always brings up something new and interesting, so thank you very much. My question is for James Allan. After John had here a speaker from Sciences Po who noted, if you remember a couple years ago, he noted that 73 out of 75 people in his area, which was, I think, anthropology or whatever it was, were all on the left side, and they essentially pushed him out, and he ended up going back, I think, to Argentina. That led me to look into some of the law schools that you're talking about, which is what my question is to you. When I looked into law schools in the United States, and I noticed that several new schools at that time, or not new schools, schools had created DEI departments, some of them quite large. They would almost rival the size of the regular law department, and they ran into 20 to 30 people. I checked the ethnicity. Most of them did not have a single white guy in there at all. Maybe there was one or two white women, and you would look through, and it was clear that these DEI portions of the law school were now becoming quite dominant. So my question to you is, that is a pendulum swing. Do we have any chance in the near future? I'm a center-left guy, but to me that's out of control. Is there any way to start getting that to move more from the law school side? I guess you were saying earlier no, but it seems to me that unless we do get that, we are going to have this imbalance in the interpretation of the law.
So there was a famous article about 12, 15 years ago in the U.S. where some statistician looked at, and I did a math degree as my first degree, but I can't remember, regression analysis, all that kind of thing, looked at all the hiring at law schools in the U.S. because, the claim for people on the left is, well, right, conservative people would rather make money, or conservative people, and he just went through it all, and, his ultimate conclusion was it's discrimination. Well, anyone who works in a university knows that, because they will not openly say we're going to hire a woman, but the dean's bonus depends on it. And anyway, the kind of person they have as a dean wants to do that. And so they have a identity politics type mindset. And, there's a fair bit of evidence that the most discriminated groups are working class white boys in Britain, in the US, in Australia. I can't speak for Europe. And so that is a big problem. And again, public donations are public information in the U.S. So you have a pretty good idea. Somebody went through every single person in every law school in the U.S. who had ever given money, and it was something like 36-1 for Democrats. Now, that didn't account for how much. It was just who did they give. So that's a real problem. Now, if we go back to when I went through university in the early 80s, of course there were more left-wing professors, right? But there was this old-fashioned American Civil Liberties Union type view that there's a competition of ideas and they like to hear this. That is gone now. I mean, most people, if you say something against their core views on anything related to sort of identity, they do not want to hear it. They want you not to be working there anymore. So the old-fashioned idea, the American Civil Liberties Union famously took the Skokie case where they spent a fortune going right to the Supreme Court to defend neo-Nazis who wanted to march through a Holocaust part of, I think it was Ohio or Illinois or somewhere. Now, the American Civil Liberties Union now is not like that at all. They just want to run a left-wing agenda. How do you fix that? Well, when I went through university professors left and right basically wanted to hire the best person. I mean, your goal as an academic when it comes to hiring should be, I want to hire someone better than me. That doesn't exist. You go in and you'll basically know, I have the oldest chair in Queensland, right? It's always been a white man. There's only been I've had it for 20 years. There's only been about 15 of us, I don't know. I can guarantee you I would bet my life, and I'd come close to betting my kid's life, that I will not be replaced by a man. It probably will not be a white woman. God knows they'll probably get a special parking pass and be transitioning. Who knows? But we know what it's not going to be. And so you think, well, how do you fix this? Well, I mean, what's going to happen is that people aren't going to send their kids to university, which is happening in the U.S. already. Or the Ivy League is seeing a massive brain drain of young, smart kids because the parents don't want to send them to Harvard and have them come out as a grievance politics, expert. So look at the SEC, like Vanderbilt or University of Texas. They used to be able to go to a Southern university if you had a pulse, and you didn't even really need a pulse when I was anybody could go to these universities. They're incredibly difficult to get into now. Incredibly difficult because people in the States are looking around going, I don't want to send I've had sabbaticals at Cornell. The Ivy League is a hotbed of one-sidedness. And I'm not saying people still don't go there, and Harvard and Yale have an amazing, Americans think they're not hierarchical. 10 years ago, every single judge on the U.S. Supreme Court either went to Yale or Harvard. There's a billion law schools in the U.S., and the only way to get on the U.S. Supreme Court is to go to Harvard. It makes Britain and Oxford and Cambridge look, open to competing views. But that is changing. And I fear that the way it's going to be fixed is universities are going to struggle badly in the next 10 to 15. AI is not going to make it any better. But there's going to be all sorts of pressure to say, well, why would I send my kids to university?
Well, if I may very quickly, one of the things that is happening in law schools, and it's probably going to be even slower than what happened, when the students at Stanford, almost physically, but in a very intimidating manner, attacked a federal judge who was not able to speak to them. Those were law school students. in effect, he did not speak. And one of the things that happened after was that several federal judges said that they will not take a clerk from Stanford, Yale, or Harvard. That is an extraordinary blow to those schools. No, Chicago is still considered pretty good. For example, so that is how it's going to change. Because the belligerence and the sense of self-righteousness they're just flying too close to the sun. It's like, let's look at the Greeks, and it is going to be like the myths. Something like this happens, and kids won't go there, because what if the Supreme Court doesn't take clerks from our schools either? What if there is a silent agreement that they won't? And for example, that's not law school, but UChicago now has the same admissions as Harvard. It's in a 4% rate. Now, well, anyway, I'm not going to go on because I'm biased there, but it's no, both kids at Chicago. So, and it's extraordinary. When they started, it wasn't like that. This is a very, very rapid decline of the Ivies. From freshman year to graduation, the rate is half of what it was when kids would start. It's a rapid decline, and it has a lot to do with what happened in 2020, and schools that did or did not allow their students to basically waste a year to riot instead of study. Parents don't want to pay for it, and they're not getting jobs, and they are $250,000 in debt, and they have stupid degrees, and I mean stupid. I'm sorry, forgive me. I know this is crude, but I mean, I'm a mother of two, and I think about it all the time, of all the kids cheated out of an education, and parents bleeding what's supposed to secure something like a dignified future. So I agree completely, 100% with James. This is just not going to go on.
Which tells you she's not married to me, because my wife never agrees with me.
No, my husband is not here. He's on the other side of the pond. Anyway.
Last word for John.
Well, let me put it this way. Excellence and fairness are at different ends of the seesaw, and we have to try to get the seesaw working reasonably. I'll give you two cases. We really need to have a situation in the universities in which the students are judged for themselves and their own abilities, and not whether they belong to certain classes. What does that require? Well, I'll give you an example to make this point. When I was at college, back in the 60s, there were always cases of a professor who seemed to be having a continual argument with one of the students. He would sort of tend to say, well, generally it was a conservative student and a liberal professor, and he would say, now let's hear what Mr. So-and-so has got to say about that, because we know he has rather unusual views. And then there'd be a back and forth. In almost all the cases I knew of that kind of relationship, at the end of the 3 years, when the student went to the professor, he generally got a glowing recommendation for the job he was going to apply for. Now, in other words, the professionalism of the clerical class, the high professional standards of the university professors, judges, and others have got to be sustained at a very high level for fairness and excellence to be combined. And I believe that until the last 30 or 40 years, that was the case. At the other end of the scale of unfairness, I was at one point I was in a high corporate position in which I had to decide about job advertisements. And there was a senior journalistic job being advertised by the company I was then with. And I looked at it and I said, look, this is a job for a journalist. This is demanding a good honors degree, and ideally a tertiary, a degree beyond that, a postgraduate thing. I said, it's for a journalist. I mean, some of the best journalists in the world have never been to school, let alone university, because they've got, well, the requirements are supposed to be shorthand typing and low weasel-like courage. And the fact is, it's not necessary for a lot of jobs that you have a degree. Of course, there are some where it's essentially you wouldn't want to have an unqualified brain surgeon. But it is really vital that we don't hold back whole series of able people simply because at some point in their life they missed out a credential-giving occupation. And I think those two things are high professional standards by the people teaching and judging and so on, and secondly, the openness to talent, which for whatever reason isn't written in some document.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you very much, Anna and James, for your wonderful conference. And thank you for the audience. Thank you.